"That's it," said my third grade teacher, Mrs. Kordecki. "That's it. Go to the principal's office, Mr. Geisen." Usually by this point, my friends and I had worn our teacher down so bad, it only took a funny look to get the ultimate punishment, the principal's office. And so there I was, head down in shame in front of the entire class of third graders walking out the door. Obviously, I walked as slowly as I could. Even if I didn't mean it, I'd learned how to play her game. If you look sad and sorry, she got what she wanted and would leave you alone. I passed through the door into the hallway, remembering my warning that I had received there earlier in the day, when Mrs. Kordecki had taken me by the ear and dragged me out of the classroom incapacitated. She'd made good on her promise, or threat as I understood it, if I didn't sit with my hands folded and silent for the rest of the day. I was headed to visit the principal, Mr. Powers. So there I was, walking slowly still because I hadn't even met the new principal yet, Mr. Powers. What a good name for an elementary principal, right? Just his name evokes images of fear and respect. I probably only had 2 or 3 classrooms to pass as I walked, not enough time to try and delay the inevitable, but I tried. It wasn't a large school by any means. I stared at the terrazzo floor, counted lockers, stopped to get a drink from the fat, white ceramic drinking fountain. I peeked in the gym at the other kids having fun, and then all that was left to do was take the left-hand turn into the principal's office. The secretary was sitting there at her desk and asked what I needed. I said, "Mrs. Kordecki sent me to see Mr. Powers." I was instructed to sit down and await my fate. The secretary stood up and peeked in the principal's office, explaining that a Mr. Geisen was there to see him. Now, as an adult, when you put a Mr. in front of a name, it's a sign of respect, but as a kid, you know it's just a way to confirm who you are. It's not a good thing. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Powers opened the door and invited me in. "Have a seat, Joshua." So I did. This time, my hands were folded, and I really did want to be silent. He asked me why I was there, and truth be told, I don't even remember the reason that time. It was probably because I was fighting or roughhousing with somebody earlier in the day. It might have been because I wasn't paying much attention. All I really did in elementary school was look out the window and dream of how I was going to build my next fort. Might have been that I was mistaken for somebody else's misdemeanor in class. But no matter what it was this time, I explained how I had indeed been warned, and that I had not lived up to my side of the deal. So I needed to come down and get the ultimate punishment from the principal. And that ultimate punishment was usually time in the holding cell, time in a room all by myself, next to the principal's office doing the work that I was missing out on in class. I recall plenty of times that I had been in there before, usually given the work as I walked out the door because the teacher who was scolding me knew I wasn't coming back. But this time was a little different. Now in this principal's office, in Mr. Powers' office, there was a child-sized desk in the corner. I was instructed to sit there for the rest of the day. I was a little disappointed at first. It meant not hiding anything. It meant sitting there doing my work for the rest of the day without even taking the obligatory lean back and yawn. I was going to be watched carefully. I imagined Mrs. Kordecki smiling at my suffering. And so I sat down, took out my books and papers, and began to look like I was working. But truth be told, I was too fired up to do that. My teacher, who had sworn to make my life hell unless I caved into her ways, she'd gotten away with it again. Not that I wasn't to blame in some ways, but somehow, too, I knew that this wasn't justice. Now, these punishments might sound completely legitimate to many of you, but this was a time in school when corporal punishment had finally been deemed a form of abuse. And Mrs. Kordecki, she was going to try and get away with as much of it as she could. Her power was derived from it, and it worked for her, or so she thought. We all lived in fear, never knowing when your ear was going to be nearly ripped off, never knowing when you were going to get belittled and yelled at, even called names. Yep, I sat there and pretended like she had made a difference in my life. I pretended like I was sorry. But truth be told, I wasn't. Not at all. I was hurt. Physically and emotionally that day by my teacher, and I didn't have a soul who was going to listen to me. I should have known better, was all the sympathy I was used to in that environment. So the day went on. I ate my lunch in Mr. Power's office. I got really bored. I got really tired, and I wanted to lay my head down. But couldn't, obviously, because Mr. Powers was right there. And then about 2 p.m., towards the end of the day, a knock came to the door. Mr. Powers got up and answered it. It was a kid with a piece of cake. They'd come to share a piece from a birthday party with the principal. Mr. Powers accepted it with gratitude and returned to his seat. He put the cake on his desk. I sat there staring at the cake out of the corner of my eye. I don't really remember if it was yellow cake with pink frosting, but my heart says it was. It was the most tempting piece of cake I ever saw. And now I was just about drooling when another knock came to the door. More cake it was. And then again and again, I don't know how many kids had birthdays that day, but plenty of them sent a piece down to the principal's office. Mr. Powers sat the cake slices on his desk. I think there were even a couple of cups of Kool-Aid too. What punishment, I thought. Mrs. Kordecki would love knowing about this. It was like one of the rings of hell in Dante's Inferno. Sugar in front of a sugar fiend, and I was unable to touch it. But then, to one of the greatest surprises and moments of grace I had ever experienced in my life, Mr. Powers said, "Would you like to have a piece of cake with me?" I bet he never saw a smile so big in his entire life. Of course I do. Are you sure, though, I'm here because I'm in in-school detention? Yes, I'm sure, said Mr. Powers. Are you ready to really talk about that yet? Cake and Kool-Aid in hand, I was. I was ready to talk about it now that somebody really wanted to listen. I remember spending the rest of the day, over an hour, talking with him about the unfair treatment that I felt I had received. I remember not keeping anything I felt from him. I remember feeling like this guy actually wanted to listen to me. A kid who had never really experienced that from a person in power before. I'd like to say that I left school that day a completely changed person. Never again to be sent to the principal's office, but I can't do that. I remember many other times of going there and sitting in Mr. Powers' office talking and eating cake. So many times finally feeling that feeling of disgust and hatred slipping out of me as a mentor listened and actually cared. Now, I don't want to oversimplify this too much, because as with most things, this is a complicated topic. But I share this story of my childhood with you today to help demonstrate that there are two different types of power in this world, two extremes. The first way is with dominance producing fear, the kind Mrs. Kordecki used. It's the kind that breeds contempt and really never works to bring about the good in this world that Christians are called to bring. And the other type is a power that is demonstrated with love and grace, the kind that Mr. Powers used. A power that doesn't play by the human rules, a power that offers grace instead of holding us to the fire of the law. The second type of power, this is the kind of power that I can attest to as the one that actually works, that actually affects the change in the world that needs to be made. I've experienced it myself, and I hope you have too. If not, you will one day. Real power isn't domination, though many of us who grew up in this country were taught that. Unfortunately, many suffering abuse because of it. Real power isn't about carrying a big stick so that people are afraid of you. At least according to the Bible, it isn't. In the Bible, we know it's about carrying a cross instead. And yeah, that doesn't really make sense if you're not a Christian. But as Christians, Jesus has proven it for us. For we here have seen the resurrection and the death of the other type of power. We are witness to the true weakness of evil power. Real power, as demonstrated in both the Old and New Testament, is about meeting people where they are, like God did for Elijah in our story today. Real power is about grace and faith in the fact that God is working in this world. Real power is about being a healthy example to those under your care. Real power is about standing up for what you believe and not letting those who want to abuse power abuse those that you love. Real power acts in love. Real power, like in our reading today, too, is the opposite of what Jezebel demonstrates. Real power isn't about force at all. But as we all know, plenty of people still don't believe what the Bible says about true power. Mrs. Kordecki, in my own experience, is the real-life example of this evil, corrupt power. She's the one in my life who is Jezebel, who sought to destroy me. And trust me, she really did. And Mr. Powers, in my experience, even with that most intimidating name, he is my real-life example of true power, as demonstrated by God, a power that acts in love and grace. A power that doesn't play by the rules, but opens up to listen and care. And it's this type of power that is real power. It's this type of loving power that makes the changes in this world that we all want to see. You know, I did change, albeit very slowly as a child. And as you know, I've even made it to the title of pastor, something that Mrs. Kordecki would have bet her house against. But you see, it wasn't because of her and her ways of power. All that did was make me want to be worse. It was because of Mr. Powers and people like him in my life who showed me that they cared and wanted me to succeed. It was because of their grace-filled ways of power that I actually was helped. Now, it may be a little of a coincidence, but when I was in college and I told my parents I wanted to be a philosophy major, well, they might have been a little disappointed at first because, there's not really any money in that. My mom did say, your elementary principal that you got to know so well, Mr. Powers, he was a philosophy major in college too. So maybe you could be a principal. I didn't know it so much before, but I guess Mr. Powers had taken the time to get my parents involved as well. Makes sense knowing how much he cared. And as a side note, To show you what happens to people who practice Jezebel's corrupt ways of power, Mrs. Kardecki, a tenured teacher, was fired that year for abuse. She ended up feeling not too different from the same way that Jezebel ended up in the Bible. And if you don't know what that famous story is, it's worth investigating. It's an image that you won't forget. It's something that you don't want to see happen to you. In conclusion, there are opposing forces or powers in this world. There is one type of power, a corrupt and evil and seductive power that leads to destruction of all who play with it. And there too is a type of power like the power of the cross, the power of Christ. And all who play with that one, to them comes a new life. Real power, lasting power. It might be different than the type that used to be okay by our society's standards. But the world is changing for the better, and the real power, God's power, the gospel's power, that is what we all need to experience. I don't know about you, but I look forward to the day, the final day, when I get sent to God's office to explain my sins. I'll bet God's got some really good cake and Kool-Aid. And I'll bet that God, the real Mr. Powers too, is just as ready and more to listen and show me the love that I have always needed in this world. Amen.